Today, the journey moves through 11 places in Tennessee where the past seems to linger just beneath the surface. Old stages, battlefields, plantations, a prison, a cave. Each holds stories told by those who work there and those who came searching for something they could not name. Listen for footsteps that refuse to fade, for music that finds its way back to empty rooms, for the cold that arrives without wind. Number 1. Ryman Auditorium, Nashville. The Ryman sits like a watchful elder in downtown Nashville, its brick facade belying a life of voices. Built in the late 19th century, it has held preachers, politicians, and the early strains of country music that shaped a nation's sound. The auditorium's balcony and stage are memory kept in wood and brass, layers of applause and prayer compressed into the grain. Workers and visitors alike speak of a presence that behaves like an attentive patron. Backstage, technicians report small things misplaced and then returned to their places, as if an unseen hand tidies instruments. A tour guide remembers the sudden hush that fell during a late-night rehearsal. It felt like someone took a breath in the room and held it, she says. The lights dimmed with no fault in the rigging. A single piano note lingered on the empty stage, though no one had touched the keys. There is a certain warmth to many accounts. The feeling is not malicious, but persistent, an echo of shows past. Today, the Ryman is a working venue and museum, frequented by fans who leave bouquets at a plaque and speak softly, as if to not disturb old patrons still listening from the wings. Number 2. Loretta Lynn's Ranch, Hurricane Mills. Out among the rolling fields of Hurricane Mills, Loretta Lynn's Ranch is less a forgotten place than a curated memory of a life lived under bright lights and country skies. The house and its surrounding artifacts draw visitors who come for a glimpse of the singer's world and, sometimes, something more. Employees sometimes hear a child's laughter near the barn at dusk, or a woman humming a tune that stops when approached. We'll be closing up, and there's this melody drifting from the house, a docent says, like someone practicing the way they used to. Vintage clothing laid out for tours has been found slightly rearranged, as if handled by careful fingers who remember how something should sit. The ranch is private property, open to fans and guided tours, and the caretakers treat recollections with affection more than alarm. Many leave with the sense that memory itself has taken permanent residence here. Music that will not quite let go. Number 3. Orpheum Theater, Memphis. The Orpheum stands on Main Street with marquee lights that have seen both vaudevilles laughter and the hush that follows a compelling performance. Its lobby retains gilded plaster and staircases that creak in familiar places. Local lore ties the theater to a young girl, sometimes named in accounts, who is said to have died in the building long before the modern renovations. Employees report the sensation of being watched from the balcony, and ushers will tell you about seats that feel occupied, though empty. I was sweeping after a late show, one usher recalls, and a little hand tapped my shoulder. When I turned, nobody. Lights flicker in the projection booth, and the distant echo of clapping seems to find the empty rows on quiet afternoons. The Orpheum remains an active performance space, its staff protective of both history and visitors. Tours happen during daylight. Patrons who catch an odd chill between acts often chalk it up to the building's age, while some walk away convinced there is something, some attentive audience, still coming to see the show. Number 4. Tennessee State Prison, Nashville. The old Tennessee State Prison, its stone walls and barred windows, keeps a heavier memory. Once housing inmates through the 20th century, its exercise yards and cells bore witness to lives constrained and institutions that shaped a harsh social landscape. The building closed and reopened as a site visitors pass through for history and, sometimes, the unsettling sense of other presences. Guides discuss locked doors that swing on their own and the muffled feeling of being watched down long corridors. One former guard, now a volunteer preservationist, speaks softly about the way footsteps sometimes echo out of sync with people in the hall. You'll be alone, and footsteps walk past the cell block like someone's making rounds. According to local reports, cameras have captured orbs and brief anomalies on footage that the staff cannot explain. The tone around the prison is careful and respectful. When stories touch on deaths or suffering, guides emphasize the human cost rather than spectacle, reminding visitors to reckon with a past of confined lives and institutional power rather than hunt for thrills. Portions of the complex are closed for safety. Others host organized tours that educate more than they entertain. Number 5. Shiloh National Military Park, Shiloh. At Shiloh, the ground itself remembers. The National Military Park preserves a battlefield where, in April 1862, thousands fought and many fell. The landscape of rolling fields and scattered monuments invites quiet. Mists lift and settle over the same terrain where medicine tents once stood and the wounded waited. Walkers describe an atmosphere that compresses time. The distant crack of a twig heard like musket fire, sudden cold spots in open fields, and the fleeting impression of figures moving in the long grass. Visitors say they sometimes hear fragments, orders shouted, a bugle's call, though no reenactment is taking place. It's like the land has its own memory, a volunteer historian explains. You can almost feel the urgency of that day pressing through. Park rangers remind those who come to honor, not to sensationalize. Memorials remain places of remembrance. Many who visit report leaving with a solemn awareness rather than fear, an acute recognition of loss that persists in the soil itself. Number 6. Stones River Battlefield, Murfreesboro. Not far from Murfreesboro, Stones River is another patch of earth where the past's intensity lingers between trees and stone markers. The December battles there produced a scale of suffering that local guides treat with reverence. The battlefield's winter winds seem to carry voices, and fog often settles low, softening outlines. Hikers and staff have reported seeing shadowy figures watching from beyond the ridges, or glimpse shapes that seem to follow, keeping pace for a time and then fading into the mist. I was walking the trail alone and felt like someone was riding alongside me, one visitor says. I looked up and there was no one, but the feeling stayed. The park remains open to the public, with interpretive centers that provide context for the events and lives affected. Visitors are encouraged to reflect on the human stories that fill the markers and to treat the site as a place for remembrance rather than thrill-seeking. Number 7. Carnton Plantation, Franklin. Carnton's red brick and formal gardens conceal a layered history, a family home that became an impromptu hospital after battle, where the living tended the wounded and the dead were laid out in urgency. The house preserves furniture and letters, objects that anchor stories of both care and loss. Staff members note a heaviness in certain rooms, an atmosphere like wet wool settling over the senses, especially near the back parlor where nurses once worked. Guides tell of doors that close gently on their own and portraits whose eyes seem to follow visitors down an empty hall. One docent remembers arranging a display at dusk and feeling the air tighten. It felt like someone had just stepped into the room to find the family's photo album. Carnton is a museum and a private home in the sense of stewardship. Its caretakers speak of the site with custody and a slow, measured affection. Visitors often leave quiet, thinking about the people who passed through those rooms, their stories kept where the house still listens. Number 8. Bell Witch Cave, Adams. The Bell Witch legend occupies a distinct place in Tennessee lore. The cave near Adams is tied to a sequence of accounts from the early 19th century, stories of unseen torment and phenomena reported by the Bell family and neighbors. The tale threads through folk memory, with variations depending on who tells it. Cave guides recount odd vibrations and voices heard at the mouth of the cavern. Hikers who pass by after sundown speak of a pressure in the air that makes conversation difficult. You don't really want to laugh when you're there, a visitor says. It feels like the walls are listening. Some insist they've seen lights that move independently of flashlights. Others simply feel watched. The cave is on private land and is visited with supervision. Guides emphasize caution, framing the Bell Witch as legend carried by generations rather than as provable fact. The narrative often functions as a cultural touchstone, less a manifesto of the supernatural than a story communities tell about boundary, fear, and the unknown that gathers at the edge of settled life. Number 9. Wheatlands Plantation, Clarksville. Wheatlands stands as a plantation house whose white columns mark a complicated past. The property's history includes the labor of enslaved people and the rhythms of an agricultural life that was not gentle for all who lived on the land. The house now draws visitors interested in architectural detail and the slower tales that linger in old rooms. Those who care for the property speak of a pall in the quarters behind the main house, and of quiet footsteps that do not fit with the schedule of staff. Sometimes it sounds like someone passing with a tray, a volunteer explains, but there's nobody there. Photographers on quiet afternoons report images shadowed by shapes that disappear upon review. Wheatland's caretakers are mindful to present the plantation's full history, acknowledging the lives of those whose labor made the estate possible. Stories of apparitions are framed alongside oral histories and archival records, with an emphasis on remembering rather than fetishizing the past. Number 10. Sensabaugh Tunnel, Kingsport. Beneath the surface of Kingsport runs a tunnel whose bent contours and damp bricks create an atmosphere that invites stories. Originally part of older rail lines and industrial infrastructure, the Sensabaugh Tunnel now draws urban explorers and local storytellers who recount a particular quiet that settles inside. Walkers describe the sound of distant dripping, magnified into a rhythm like a heartbeat, and an oppressive coolness that presses against the skin. Some report the sense of being followed for a stretch, footsteps echoing out of step, a shadow that lingers at a bend and then is gone. The light will change on its own, one explorer says. Your flashlight will dim and then come back as if something passed between you and the bulb. Local authorities caution against unsupervised entry for safety reasons, but those who go with permission speak of leaving with a story rather than bruises, an odd, lingering impression of motion where there should be only stillness. Number 11. Reed House Hotel, Chattanooga. The Reed House sits near the river, its rooms once occupied by travelers, sailors, and those passing through Chattanooga's changing economy. Over time, rumors grew of a particular room where guests report feeling watched or finding items slightly disturbed after a night's stay. Housekeeping staff have described linens folded differently upon return and faucets left running, though no guest reports doing so. A night clerk recalls checking an empty hallway and feeling a presence at the foot of the stairs. I could feel my hair stand up. It wasn't angry, just very aware. Guests have written in journals about unexplained cold patches in summer months and radios that switch channels without human touch. Today, the Reed House welcomes visitors and treats accounts as part of the establishment's texture, stories that accompany creaks and sighs inherent to old buildings. Management encourages respectful stays and records unusual occurrences as curiosities rather than claims. As the list winds through town squares, fields, and halls, a pattern emerges: memory as weathering force, places that keep small, persistent echoes. Sometimes the phenomena are physical, doors that move, lights that change, sometimes purely atmospheric, a muffled sense of time overlapping itself. What remains constant is the human response: caretakers who record what they cannot explain, visitors who enter expecting entertainment and leave with a measure of reverence, communities that hold their stories in equal parts caution and affection. Further west, beyond these 11 points, many more stories circulate by campfire and in diner booths, passed from neighbor to neighbor. Not all of them can be confirmed. Many are local legend and memory braided together. Yet they matter because they are how people make sense of places where loss occurred, where laughter once rang, where music lived and was not meant to be forgotten. The next stop on this route would lead to other sites with their own textures, places where footsteps echo in empty hallways or where fog hangs stubbornly in low fields, and with each the same invitation: to listen carefully, to remember, and to treat the past with the respect it deserves. Beyond the towns named on the map, the landscape keeps its own archives. In a hollow where the road thins to gravel, an old textile mill leans into the river, its boardwalks bowed and its windows opaque with decades of dust. Former workers come back on weekends to straighten a plaque, to bring a thermos, and sit where the sun still catches the warped floorboards. They speak of a particular hour in late afternoon when the mill seems to remember its machines. A soft percussion of metal threads, a timbre like a faraway loom, so precise that those who have heard it can point to the exact span of floor where it appears. Engineers and historians shrug, wind around the chimneys, they say. Yet the men and women who ran the looms tell a different truth. Memory lives beneath the paint. Nearer to the highway, a one-room schoolhouse endures beneath a canopy of maples. It was restored by a coalition of former pupils and a handful of volunteers. They repainted the original chalkboards and rehung the bell, and each autumn the community gathers for a day of readings and soup. Children now run across the yard, but at dusk the teachers who remember teaching there pause at the threshold. They speak of a neat, childlike silence that settles in the seats after sunset, as if the room were waiting for the next lesson. Sometimes, in the stillness, a small, clean scent of chalk and bread lingers where no chalk has been used and no oven burned. The volunteers have learned to accept the anomaly as part of the building's personality, an echo of the lives that once shaped the timbre of the room. On a stretch of state route where neon signs once blinked with the names of motels and diners, a shuttered roadside cafe holds on to a different past. The booths are scarred and sticky under the varnish. A jukebox sits mute, its lights long dead. For years, travelers claimed an odd generosity of space in the cafe's back corner. They would find chairs overturned in neat, intentional groupings, or a napkin folded into the shape of a heart and left on an empty plate. The owner, who reopened the place as a seasonal pop-up, learned to leave a fresh bouquet each morning on that table and to write in a small ledger the names and wishes visitors scribbled. The ledger reads like a map of longing, notes for reunions, apologies never spoken, children remembered. The staff no longer ask for explanations. They treat the ledger and the bouquet as offerings to whatever keeps company with the place. Not every site hums with the same intensity. Some resist story altogether, presenting only the quiet dignity of abandonment. A farmhouse with china still arranged in a cabinet, a field where a stone wall bisects a pasture like a seam in cloth. In those places, the local archivists tell fewer tales of footsteps and more of slow erasure, paint peeling, names weathering out of tombstones, songs that fade because there is no one left to sing them. Their work becomes urgency, to collect, to label, to digitize, to speak aloud the names that might otherwise dissolve into dust. Across these varied locations, a practice has taken hold among caretakers and curators: ritualized attentiveness. They conduct oral history sessions beneath porch roofs. They digitize shoeboxes of litters. They train interns to listen not only for dramatic events, but for quiet anomalies: a draft that arrives without an open window, a clock that stops at the hour someone remembers leaving, a faint, brief impression of a voice on a phone recording. They archive badly spelled stories and faded photographs with equal care because the crooked edges and the misstates are part of the truth. Memory, they insist, is not a single narrative to be polished for visitors. It is a congregation of small details that, when kept together, form a map of what was lived. And there are times when the people who steward these places admit to a tenderness that has nothing to do with explanation. They will walk a cemetery at dawn, place a coin on a stone weathered smooth by rain, and speak aloud a name they have read only from a ledger. In the process of saying the name, they transform it from a line on a page into someone who once smelled of soap and smoke, someone who once argued at a table or hummed a hymn. That act, The simple, deliberate speaking of a life seems to be the truest way communities hold back the erasure that time brings. The route continues in that spirit, not a hunt for fright, but a series of careful hearings. Each place offers its own texture, metallic echoes, cool puffs of air, misplaced objects, soft choruses of recalled speech, and each asks the same thing of those who pass through: attend, record what you can, leave the place better known than you found it. When you listen in that mode, the sites do not only become curiosities for an afternoon, they become repositories of lives that insist on being remembered, not apprehended. The invitation is steady and simple. Step lightly, speak kindly, and keep a careful ledger of what the places tell you. Sometimes, a place speaks only through what it will not say. There is a brick post office on the edge of a town whose windows are perpetually streaked with the ghosts of posters once stapled there. Lost pets, fares, a political promise that never landed. The sorting room smells faintly of paper and menthol. On the highest shelf, a bundle of unopened envelopes waits, browned at the folds. The postmistress, who has worked mornings there for 30 years, keeps one of those envelopes beneath her counter. It is addressed in a handwriting that trembled half a century ago and never traveled. When visitors ask about it, she draws breath and says only, "People like letters to rest where they were meant to sleep." After that, she will take a pencil and, without opening the envelope, write on the back the name that appears on the outside and slide it back into its place. The act is small, almost ceremonial, yet those names, listed like seeds, become a ledger of absence translated into care. At the railway platform, where timetables hang like prayers, a bench holds coins worn smooth by the touch of hands that once planned departures. A retired conductor, who spends afternoons sweeping the platform, keeps a notebook of false arrivals, stories told by passengers who swear they heard a whistle on a summer evening when no train was due. He writes the time and the scent noted at the hour: coal, jasmine, diesel, wood smoke. New interns, skeptical at first, begin to understand these entries as another language of place, pattern maps of memory that point to what the townspeople carry inside them. On nights when fog presses over the rails, the conductor sets a thermos of tea beside the bench and leaves a scrap of paper with a name written on it. Sometimes the tea steam curls toward the lights, exactly where someone remembers standing to say goodbye. Not all memories demand witnesses. Some hang in the architecture. The County Theater, restored by citizen subscription, kept a ledger of a different sort. Programs, pressed between pages, with notes in the margins. First show, we sat in the back, he proposed during the overture. The young woman who runs the box office has a habit of sitting after last call in the dark aisles and reading those marginalia aloud. Her voice stitches the opaque into a narrative, and the empty seats respond with a hush that feels like gratitude. Once, on a rainy Tuesday, a man slipped into the lobby and, at the sight of a program from 1967, began to cry. He had not intended to come to the theater. He said he had driven by, and a sign had asked for stories. He placed a folded photograph of two children on the program and wrote one line in the ledger: "They loved the trains." That line stayed there, becoming a new ridge upon which other small sentences alighted. As the route winds, the people who tend these places form a clandestine fellowship, unofficial but faithful, who exchange reports as if by semaphore. They leave notes in mail slots, a cigarette tin full of sea glass tokens from a beach that lost its name, a cassette whose tape contains a lullaby hum with a voice that half remembers French vowels. They borrow one another's imaginations and return them knotted with new detail. When an archivist from the museum discovers a shoebox, the County Theater, restored by citizen subscription, kept a ledger of a different sort. Programs, pressed between pages, with notes in the margins. First show, we sat in the back. He proposed during the overture. The young woman who runs the box office has a habit of sitting after last call in the dark aisles and reading those marginalia aloud. Her voice stitches the opaque into a narrative, and the empty seats respond with a hush that feels like gratitude. Once, on a rainy Tuesday, a man slipped into the lobby and, at the sight of a program from 1967, began to cry. He had not intended to come to the theater. He said he had driven by, and a sign had asked for stories. He placed a folded photograph of two children on the program and wrote one line in the ledger: "They loved the trains." That line stayed there, becoming a new ridge upon which other small sentences alighted. As the route winds, the people who tend these places form a clandestine fellowship, unofficial but faithful, who exchange reports as if by semaphore. They leave notes in mail slots, a cigarette tin full of sea glass tokens from a beach that lost its name, a cassette whose tape contains a lullaby hummed with a voice that half remembers French vowels. They borrow one another's imaginations and return them knotted with new detail. When an archivist from the museum discovers a shoebox of postcards with a single recurring phrase, "waiting for the parade," she writes to the cafe owner and the conductor and the postmistress. In time, they gather evidence: a photograph in a family album, an old insurance ledger that lists a town event, a cake tin with a scorch mark shaped like a star. Each confirmation is an act of repair, an argument made in small things that the past was lived and should be acknowledged. There are practical rules that have emerged among them, practical because ritual without method frays. They do not pry for spectacle. They never remove objects from a place without permission. They photograph only in daylight, with care. They make 2 copies of every recording, because 1 copy can be lost, but 2 begins the work of redundancy that memory requires. And when they collect oral testimony, they bring tea and sit long enough for silences to become comfortable. The volunteers learn to set aside the urge to explain anomalies. Explanation narrows possibility. Instead, they catalog qualities: temperature, timing, cadence, and listen for repetitions. A draft that appears at noon 3 days running, a clock that stops at 5:07 on the day of a funeral, these patterns, noted down, form beats in a communal score. The ledger, literal and metaphorical, follows them like a map. In some towns, it is a slim composition book with a taped spine. In others, it is a ledger bound in green leather, its pages modeled by sun. Names are entered without ceremony and yet with affection. Mrs. Halpern's humming, boy who whistled on Richmond Road, the woman who left knitting in the pew. Sometimes an entry is a short story, a paragraph about a stolen ribbon, a quarrel settled by a pie, a kitten saved from a drain. The entries accumulate, and with them, a strange living geography forms. The map is not of highways and parcels, but of remembered gestures, where songs were sung, where hands were held, where promises were broken and mended. On the margins, caretakers draw tiny symbols: a star for a name that has been spoken aloud in a reading, a wave for a memory corroborated by at least 3 people, a circle when an object has been returned to its rightful place. One evening, when the autumn light had thinned to something like a memory of gold, they convened in the schoolroom that reopened for adult classes and soup suppers. The room tasted of chalk and bread. The blackboard still held a faint trace of arithmetic left undone. They set the ledger on a small table under the hanging lamp and asked for volunteers to speak. The request was quiet and plain: bring 1 name, 1 object, 1 sentence. The purpose was not performance, but recognition, the ritual of turning a ledger line into a spoken life. People came with folded papers, with rings found in garden soil, with recipes written in a hand that trembled. The postmistress produced the sealed envelope from beneath her counter and, with a gumption that surprised even her, read the name written on it. A woman in the back read aloud a grocery list her mother had carried to the end. A teenage volunteer, who had been skeptical about the whole enterprise until this night, lifted a scrap of cloth stained with sauce and said, "This was from my grandmother's apron. She always burned the corners." The room held these confessions like fruit held in cupped hands. Each spoken name widened the ledger's smallness into a room full of people. Stories braided with more stories, a child's mispronounced hymn, an argument at a bridge, the name of a dog baked into a pie crust, a promise to return that was kept. When the reading ended, no one tried to tidy those memories into a tidy lesson. They placed the objects on the long windowsill, and for a moment, the sill looked like an altar. A thimble, a bus ticket, a pressed sprig of rosemary, a child's shoe. Someone suggested leaving a bouquet beside the bench of the post office, and someone else proposed adding photographs to the ledgers at the cafe. The ideas were small, actionable things that honored the basic lesson the route had been teaching: attend, speak, leave a mark that invites others to attend again. Outside, the dusk deepened, and the street lamps blinked on. The sound of a kettle in the kitchen mingled with the dim chorus of voices folding into ordinary talk. They locked the door to the schoolroom together, not as a final gesture, but as a promise to return. On the way home, the young volunteer who had read about the apron carried the scrap of cloth in his pocket. He pressed his fingers against the frayed edge until the fabric warmed. He had learned something that could not be cataloged in metadata or proofed in a report. Names become people when they are said aloud, and an object becomes sacred when someone remembers how it was used. The route does not end with a ceremony. It continues the following week with new anomalies and with the same old small attentions. The ledger grows thicker. The postmistress writes another name on the back of an envelope and slides it home. The cafe owner updates his bouquet and adds a fresh page to his own notebook for the woman who left knitting in pew 6. And somewhere on the platform, the conductor folds a scrap of paper into the shape of a boat and tucks it beneath a coin on the bench. They do not ask to be believed. Their work is quieter, to tend the tender places, to hold the ledger as if it were a body, and to teach a new generation to listen for the small voices that cling to wood and brick. Memory, in their hands, is not a museum of trophies, but a living practice, an insistence that the lives once present in a place be given every small mercy of being known. They keep on walking, on gathering, on speaking names into the soft dark where they can still be heard.